the photograph was never meant to be seen. Folded between the yellowing pages of a cracked family Bible, it slid loose when the leather binding gave way. The smell of mildew clung to it, sharp, damp, the scent of years locked in a place where air seldom moved. At first glance, it looked no different than any relic of the early 20th century, a family gathered stiffly before the lens, unsmiling, dressed in their Sunday best. But then, the details began to speak. One child's eyes refused to align, pulled toward opposite directions, leaving her gaze fractured and lost. Another boy's jaw seemed unfinished, jutting at a sharp, unnatural angle, his lips unable to close. In the background, an older girl loomed tall and thin, her forehead disproportionately wide, her expression vacant, almost spectral. They were not posed so much as assembled, like pieces that didn't quite belong. The paper was brittle in my hands, edges curling inward as though recoiling from what it carried. Behind me, the wind pressed through the cracks of the abandoned farmhouse, rattling loose boards like a warning. Dust motes drifted in slow spirals, catching the fading light, making the moment feel less like discovery and more like intrusion. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, I could hear the faint scurry of rats, living things nesting among forgotten bones of the past. The question came unbidden, like a whisper rising from the photo itself. Who were these children? Were they victims of disease, casualties of isolation, or evidence of something whispered about but never spoken aloud? The county where the Bible was found had long been sealed off by geography, mountains pressing in, roads half-finished, hollows that swallowed travelers whole. Outsiders rarely came. Those who did seldom stayed. But within those valleys, stories festered, families too close, bloodlines too tangled, children born marked by soul, secrets their parents never confessed. Doctors once dismissed the tales as rumor, the idle talk of poor, uneducated communities. Yet the faces in that photograph cannot be explained away so easily. Each gaze, each deformity felt like testimony carved into flesh. And as the wind howled through the cracks, I was left with one question echoing louder than the rest. What kind of truth forces a community to bury its children in silence, and why are their graves never marked by names? The county was not drawn on maps with precision. It was the kind of place you only reached if you already belonged there, a hollow pressed deep between ridges that rose like watchmen against the outside world. Dirt roads wound upward, then vanished into thickets of oak and pine. In winter, the streams froze over, leaving silver veins cutting through the hills. In summer, the air hung heavy with the smell of rot and wet earth, cicadas droning endlessly, their song a reminder that time moved differently here. The houses, what few there were, stood at angles that betrayed age and neglect. Some leaned into the hills, supported by stone foundations that cracked long ago. Others sagged into the earth itself, porches collapsing inward, roofs rusting through with holes that let the rain drip straight onto warped floorboards. The barns were worse, skeletal frames gnawed by termites, their doors hanging open like gaping mouths. It was a landscape not of growth, but of slow, steady decay. Isolation was not merely geography, it was survival. Families clung to one another, tied by blood and need. To leave meant hunger, to stay meant silence. Outsiders were watched with suspicion, their footsteps followed by eyes behind curtains, and if they stayed too long, they were often encouraged, gently or otherwise, to leave. In that silence, rumors grew wild. Some said the county was cursed, that a great sin had once been committed and the land itself demanded penance. Others swore that no curse was needed, that poverty and solitude had done the work on their own. Still, the whispers always circled back to the children. Strange births, infants hidden away, faces that looked not quite right. At the edges of the graveyards, the stones told their own story. Tiny markers, no names, only dates. So many dates, whole rows of them small and unassuming, crumbling beneath moss. Some believed they were ear stillbirths. Others claimed they were something else, children carried to term but never spoken of, never baptized, never allowed to exist outside the shadow of the family that bore them. And always there was the question of the doctors. Did they not see? Or did they see too much and look away? In sealed counties like this, who had the power to call truth what it was? The woods whispered the answer in their silence. What happens when a community decides its secrets are safer buried than spoken? Long before any photograph surfaced, the stories were already there, told in hushed tones around wood stoves, traded between neighbors who trusted each other enough to let the words escape. They were never written, never recorded in newspapers, but they endured like smoke in the rafters. Some said the strangeness began with a single family, generations back. A brother and sister who refused to marry outside their hollow. Their children grew into adults who repeated the same mistake, not out of malice but out of necessity. There were no roads then, no rail lines, no visitors to bring new names or blood. Isolation had its own gravity, pulling kin toward kin. Others swore it was not one family but many. Entire clusters of cabins where the only courtship possible was with a cousin or an uncle, or even a father's second wife's daughter. The lines blurred until no one could say where one family ended and the next began. The result, they whispered, was seen in the children, eyes too far apart, spines twisted, minds that never grew past infancy. Of course, no one ever spoke these rumors aloud when a stranger came through town. To accuse was to shame, and shame in such a place was worse than death. Pride was fragile, easily shattered. Families would rather suffer in silence than give their neighbors the satisfaction of being right. But in the corners of the community, the evidence piled quietly. A boy who never learned to speak, only to grunt and cry. A girl who walked bent over, her back warped in a shape no doctor could name. Infants who lived a week, a day, or not at all. Neighbors claimed not to notice, yet they all saw. They always saw. There were those who tried to explain it away. Bad water, they muttered. Weak stock. Others blamed curses carried from the old country, sins brought across the ocean and planted in Appalachian soil. The folklore was as twisted as tea, facts, but one detail never changed. The children did not look like other children, and beneath it all lay a deeper question, unspoken but ever present. Were these simply tales born of cruelty and gossip, or did the whispers hide a truth too terrible to acknowledge? The air grew heavier with each retelling, and still the silence of the families endured. But silence cannot stop decay. Every rumor eventually leaves behind a trace, no matter how carefully hidden, and in this county the traces lay scattered like breadcrumbs for anyone willing to search. It began with the photographs. Old, curling at the edges, tucked away in attics where dust grew thick as velvet. The images were never meant for strangers' eyes. Families posed stiffly, their Sunday clothes pressed, their expressions somber. Yet the children betrayed what the parents could not hide, eyes wandering in opposite directions, skulls shaped unevenly, some too wide, some alarmingly narrow, mouths set in odd angles, jaws that never closed quite right. A doctor might call them deformities, the community called them unfortunate accidents. Beyond the photographs were the tombstones, graveyards deep in the woods, almost forgotten. There, rows of markers stood no taller than a man's knee, tiny stones, most without names, some marked only with a single year. Entire sections of cemeteries devoted to children who never reached a second birthday. Moss crawled over the carvings, the inscriptions fading as though the land itself wished to erase the memory. But when counted, the numbers told a story of repetition. Generation after generation, the same patterns of loss. And then there were the barns, half-collapsed structures on the edges of properties, their doors chained long ago. Neighbors swore they were once used to keep livestock, but whispers suggested something else. Children too strange for the outside world, hidden away from sight. Some lived their short years within those walls, never knowing the sky. Others, if the stories are true, were buried before they ever learned to walk. Doctors' records, what little survived, were equally telling. Sparse notes, vague descriptions, developmental delay, failure to thrive. Nothing more. the language of avoidance. To write the truth was to condemn and perhaps to implicate. So instead, they wrote around it, leaving behind only shadows of what they saw. Still, the evidence refused to disappear. It seeped through photographs, stones, barns, and whispered recollections. Taken alone, each piece might be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. But what happens when patterns are denied? When evidence is buried in the very soil of a county determined to keep its secrets? The answer may not be found in paper or stone, but in the blood that flowed through generation after generation. A curse carried forward, hidden in plain sight. The further one digs into the story, the more the line between folklore and fact begins to blur. Ask an old-timer, and he might lean back in his chair, spit into the dirt, and mutter that nothing strange ever happened in the county. Press harder, and his voice may drop lower, words thick with warning. Some things ain't meant to be spoken of. Folklore offered its own explanations. Some said a curse had been laid upon the valley by a preacher's daughter, wronged and cast out in shame. Others swore it was older than that the land itself rejected the families, punishing them for digging coal from its belly and spilling blood over property lines. Tales spread of ghostly children seen wandering in the woods at night, eyes wide, limbs crooked, calling out for mothers who never answered. But alongside those tales came stories that sounded less like myth and more like memory. A child who never attended school, though no one admitted why. A family who buried 3 infants in a single year, yet insisted their household was blessed. A young man who vanished after sickness, though neighbors whispered his body had been hidden to keep outsiders from asking questions. The county's history made it easy for fact and folklore to intertwine. Poverty kept families bound together. Superstition kept them silent. And when outsiders tried to pry, they found doors closed, voices quiet, and eyes watching from behind torn curtains. Some researchers who ventured in during the mid-20th century left baffled. One doctor's journal, smuggled out decades later, described cases of congenital irregularities and familial clustering, but his words were clinical, detached. Nowhere did he write the word inbreeding. It was as if the term itself was forbidden, too heavy to set on paper. So which was it? Was the county haunted by the ghosts of its own sins, or by the very real consequences of a gene pool drawn too tightly? Were the tales of spectral children merely a way to explain the unexplainable, or were they warnings disguised as folklore, truths softened into stories so the community could live with itself? Some said folklore was safer, others swore the truth was darker. But what if there was never a difference at all? What if the folklore was simply the fact wrapped in shadows to keep it from burning too bright? Generation after generation, year after year, the same curse. The county seemed unable to escape its own reflection. Every decade brought new children, and with them, the same familiar marks. A girl born with a cleft so severe she could not swallow. A boy whose legs bent inward like twisted branches, never straightening no matter how he grew. Infants with swollen heads, their cries echoing through cabins before fading into silence. Each family whispered, it was chance, bad luck, God's will. But behind closed doors, everyone knew the truth. The blood was repeating itself. Stillbirths became so common they were almost expected. Mothers carried the weight of grief in silence, burying their babies in shallow plots near the tree line, covering them with rocks so the animals wouldn't dig. Fathers drank themselves into stupors, not to forget, but to dull the sting of helplessness. And through it all, the families clung together more tightly than ever, even as their closeness bred more sorrow. The elders spoke of it as if it were a curse, something inherited not only in blood, but in fate. We pay for the sins of our fathers, one old woman muttered to a visiting preacher, her eyes glazed as though she saw ghosts walking just beyond the porch. To her, and many others, the cycle could never be broken. The hills themselves demanded sacrifice, and the children bore the cost. There were attempts to escape. A young man left once, walking miles to catch a train that carried him beyond the mountains. For a while, His letters came back, filled with stories of city life and work, but eventually the letters stopped. Some said he built a new life, others swore the blood in his veins betrayed him even there, that he fell ill, or mad, or worse. The family never spoke his name again. The pattern continued, undeniable yet unspoken. Families chained by silence, by shame, by the knowledge had their names carried shadows too deep to outrun. Every new child was a coin flipped in the dark. Some were spared, others were not. And so the curse grew roots, burying itself deeper with each passing year. Not just a genetic fate, but a psychological one. A legacy of secrecy, of denial, of graves unmarked and stories untold. But what if curses are not merely tales? What if they are truths we dare not name? Truths written not in superstition but in bone, blood, and the faces of children. The photograph still lies between the pages of that Bible, its edges curling inward like withered leaves. It is not just an image, it is a doorway, a frozen moment that refuses to fade no matter how many times the county tries to bury its past. The children stare out with vacant eyes, their faces both innocent and unsettling, as though they knew their existence carried a secret no one dared to name. Each artifact, the photographs, the graves, the barns, points to the same truth. Something happened here that the world was not meant to see. Doctors denied it. Families silenced it. The county sealed it. Yet silence has a way of amplifying the echoes, and those echoes have drifted beyond the ridges, out into the world where the whispers can no longer be contained. We are left with fragments, a tombstone without a name, a record marked only with failure to thrive. A photograph where every eye looks away from the lens, except one, staring straight through time. These fragments do not give us answers, but they ask questions more chilling than any conclusion could provide. Was it poverty, isolation, superstition, or was it something darker, an unspoken pact of denial that allowed children to suffer in silence so the community could survive its shame? Some say the curse has long since ended, that modern roads and new blood washed it away, but others insist the bloodline remains, hidden deeper now, its members taught from birth never to speak, never to show themselves beyond the mountains. The truth may never be fully known, and perhaps that is the greatest horror of all, not the deformities, not the graves, not even the whispers, but the silence that endures. Silence is stronger than memory, silence is survival, yet the photograph still exists, and as long as it does, the story refuses to die. Somewhere out there, descendants may walk among us, carrying the same blood, the same shadows, the same unspoken past. And so we are left with one final question, lingering like a whisper in the dark. What if the most deformed children on record were never recorded at all, and what if their blood still walks quietly beside us, waiting to be seen?